Okay, this is your video. Sorry this isn't upfront and personal. Hope you can get through this without too much trouble. Thanks to Emily for setting this up and for taking care of you guys. Hope the quiz went well. Hope you had an opportunity to review quiz 3 before we get to this point. I think you should have taken quiz 4 today and reviewed quiz 3 before you get to this point. First thing we need to talk about today is how lab is going. Understand that there were some labs that were turned in late because there was some confusion about when the labs were due. They're due noon on Friday, not on Thursday as the one of the syllabi says. You should get those back by Wednesday of this week for sure, so you have a little bit of feedback before you have to write your next lab. So you have Thursday and Friday to put together your next lab after having received your feedback. One question about this week's lab is about what is reaction time and how accurate of a statement is it to say that we have a computer system that measures reaction time. Remember that response time is comprised of both reaction time and movement time, and so really when you have a computer system that measures both, we're really measuring response time, so that does kind of make the results not specific. So now we're going to go on to chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about nervous system, how it affects motor learning and motor control. And I think the first question that people ask is why worry about the nervous system? I think the reason why is because you can't really understand how the system works unless you know what the system is. The primary analogy is the mechanic versus an average driver, and how well do they know their car. A driver can get a car to move, but it's a mechanic who can figure things out when things aren't going right and when things aren't perfect. He has insights into what things cause what specific types of behavior, and similarly, understanding the nervous system can help you as a coach, a clinician, or as a teacher. So the first thing we need to do is talk about what a cell is, what a nerve cell is. And I think most of you have had some basic anatomy, so you understand some of the pieces of the puzzle. Here's the generic looking cell. I hope you understand that this is just a generic cell. It's not how they are in real life, but they demonstrate with this diagrammatic type of picture what the components of a nerve cell are. We have a dendrite, a cell body, an axon terminals. I hope that you understand that a Schwann cell, which is a myelinated sheath, allows for faster conduction of nerve impulses. And I hope you also understand that the chemical response at the end of a neuron is not electrical. So usually we have in the transmission of a nerve response something chemical across a dendrite, which then causes an electrical response that goes down the axon that then results with another chemical process as neurotransmitters cross the dendritic junction and cause the next cell to respond to the initial response. So I just want to give you an idea of some of the multiple types of neurons that maybe all have this basic cell structure but are not exactly alike. There we go. Sorry. Can you see how many different types of neurons there are? They all have different functions and are found in different places in the body. Neurons that we find in the spinal cord tend to be long and just branch from one end of the spinal cord to another, whereas different parts of the brain have multiple connections or branch in just two ways, or perhaps have multiple branches in several different directions. This is more like an octopus with lots and lots of dendrites and one primary axon. They all have different functions in the nervous system, and so when you hear that one neuron is a specific type of neuron, you'll get to that when you get to neuroanatomy, if that's the course that you choose. Just understand that they're not all exactly alike. So the next thing we need to do is understand the brain and some things about brain anatomy. And I hope you know that the central nervous system is defined as the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that. You have here a picture of kind of a diagrammatic image of a brain, which tends to be broken down into specific segments. We talk about frontal cortex, parietal, occipital, temporal lobes, with the cerebellum behind. Cerebellum meaning the mini brain. And so when we talk about parietal, not on here. This color right here is parietal. Here we go. Parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then frontal lobe. Those are the segments of the brain that we would hope you would be able to identify. And then you would also be able to identify some of the functions of those specific sections. Movement, both skilled movement and voluntary movement, are in what's called the motor cortex. And there's a gyrus, or kind of a valley, that comes down and separates motor from sensory in the cortex. So sensory cortex is right here. Motor cortex is in front of that cingulate gyrus. So that's kind of an important demarcation for our purposes in this course. You can also see that speech, all the stuff that is important in the frontal lobe, like planning, short-term memory, problem solving, even problem solving as it relates to motor tasks, that all happens up here in the frontal cortex. You can see here that balance and coordination is largely impacted by the cerebellum, and sensation is mostly right here. So all of the things that have to deal with pressure, temperature, how those things interact with our nervous system to help us produce movement based on what we feel, are right there. So one thing that this image shows is what is called the supplemental motor area, or the SMA. I think that as you read more in motor learning, you kind of become aware of how the supplemental motor area interacts with so many different parts of the frontal cortex and the motor cortex to make specific things happen, and how it's involved in learning. So we'll get to that in about chapter 6 or 7. The other thing that you notice is that the basal ganglia is outlined here, and the basal ganglia has a big impact on our initiation of movement and coordination of specific movements. One thing I wanted to show you is how the diencephalon, or the midbrain, has connections with the rest of the brain. So we hear about the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And this image right here kind of gives you a little bit of an indication of how the hypothalamus is related to the pituitary. But really what we think about in the midbrain is the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has largely kind of a hormonal effect. It interacts with the pituitary to cause release of specific hormones, etc., that govern how our body responds in specific situations. But the thalamus itself, which butts up right against the hypothalamus, is essentially the center, the brain center. It's where all of the nervous input and all of the various types of sensory, vision, auditory, proprioception, pressure, temperature, all of those things come together in the thalamus and then are kind of processed before the initiation of movement occurs. So let's make sure that we understand that there are two halves to the brain. There's a cerebrum on both sides. The cerebellum also has two halves that can be essentially divided right down the middle. It's hard to see in a parietal section, but if we were to turn it 90 degrees, you'd see that there's a central sulcus, much like that. And if we basically cut the brain in half with a sharp object or knife, you can see that it divides quite evenly right down that sulcus. Okay, so now I want to talk specifically about the basal ganglia for just a second. You saw there's a little bit of that basal ganglia right here in the image on the screen. Hopefully you can picture this. A lot of times that you'll see pictures of how different parts of the basal ganglia interact to cause movement. Things that are called the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, the putamen, or the substantia nigra. All of those are kind of crazy names, really, without understanding any further about neuroanatomy. But they're very important in initiation and control of movement. So things like Parkinson's disease or cerebral palsy, they're all disorders of basal ganglia. And learning how sequential tasks are learned almost automatically without concentrating hinges on our understanding of how the globus pallidus and the putamen and the substantia nigra work together. So all of those things together make up the basal ganglia. I wanted you to just see how some of these centers you see how we have substantia nigra, globus pallidus, internus and externus, the putamen, caudate nucleus, and here's the thalamus. Much of what we read about is how the thalamus interacts with the globus pallidus to make things happen, and how, specifically in Parkinson's disease, how the substantia nigra's effect on the rest of the basal ganglia interferes with our ability to initiate movement. I think it's really interesting when you see this in cross-section. You can see that basically this is the front of my brain. So it's a cross-section just like this through the frontal plane. And this is kind of hard to picture how these things all come together unless you realize that this is what the globus pallidus looks like, or excuse me, the basal ganglia looks like. And so if we were to turn this in frontal section and cut right across the front, you can see how this lateral part of the basal ganglia is also associated with another part of the basal ganglia, which is associated with another part of the basal ganglia, which are all connected. So the things that we call caudate nucleus, right? Globus pallidus, putamen, they're all part of the same structure, but when you cut it in cross-section, they are next to each other, not all part of the same structure. So I hope that that picture helps you understand how it really is in the brain. I want you to take a second right now and take a look at video. So Emily's going to cue something up on YouTube. Rather than looking at it on video, you can actually look at it on the screen.